Well, good morning, everybody. So it's the morning of Sunday, the 19th of April, and things have changed in the United Kingdom this week because what happened on Thursday is our acting Prime Minister, Dominic Raab, announced that there would be a 3-week extension to the lockdown in our country, which began 3.5 weeks ago. I don't think this is the right thing to do. Personally, I think that the evidence and data that's now coming in shows that there isn't much difference in terms of the mortality rates between countries that have had a lockdown and countries that haven't had a lockdown in a similar geographical area. I mean, if you look at Western Europe, for example, there's just one country that decided not to have a lockdown, which was Sweden. And Sweden has been pilloried and smeared all over the mainstream media because it didn't have a lockdown. And they're almost hoping that Sweden is going to have a high mortality rate, which I think is a bit sick, to be honest. But actually, if you look at Sweden's mortality rate per million people, it's lower than the UK, much lower. It's lower than France, it's lower than Spain, Italy and Belgium and the Netherlands, but it's higher than Germany and Denmark and Norway, so it's somewhere in the middle. So that tells me that whether you have a lockdown or not, or a shutdown or not, that's not the factor that is making much difference in terms of the spread and transmission of this virus and the mortality rate. There are other factors such as mask wearing and early testing, early contact tracing and quarantining people who are arriving in your country early on. We didn't do that in the UK. People are still coming through the airports at a rate of over 100,000 people per week. They just come off the planes and just go and travel wherever they want to. There's no quarantining, there's no testing. To be quite honest with you, it's a bit too late to do anything. I think that this is a virus which we know is highly contagious. It spreads through the air. It can survive on surfaces for up to 9 days. And we should have closed the borders and closed off flights from China, Iran, Italy, and the places where the virus spread very early. We should have done that back in January and February. We haven't done it by now. To be honest, it's a bit too late. I mean, if you close the airports now, it's a bit like closing the stable door after the horse has bolted. It's not going to actually do much now because it's too late. But the virus has been spreading through the UK for at least 3 months. It's gone everywhere. Prince Charles has had it. The Prime Minister's had it. Other government ministers have had it. And it's now looking like we've got to the peak and actually it's coming down again. If you look at the number of people actually in hospital in London for this Wuhan virus, it's gone up and now it's coming down again, and that's being replicated over other areas in the UK. So it looks as though we're over the worst of it, and over the next 2 or 3 weeks it's going to come down. So it's time to end this, and I really don't think that the government actually realise what they've done to the economy and what they've done to civil liberties and what they've done to the very fabric of the nation and the way that people relate to each other and the mistrust that is built up between ordinary people and the police in particular. Now, that was there and that was happening anyway with all of these kind of hate crime, hate speech laws where police forces in some areas were going and harassing people just for making a joke or expressing ordinary opinions, which were not in any way, shape or form hateful or should not have been considered to be crimes. Not least, for example, in Humberside, where you had them chasing down Harry Miller for making a poem about transgenderism, for example. But that's now gone into harassing and criminalizing people for just doing normal things like sitting in the park enjoying the sunshine, or walking along a beach a long way away from any other people, and so on. And neighbours are now informing on their neighbours for having dinner parties, or walking around with other people in their family. And people are expressing selective outrage over these things. So these are not crimes, but they shouldn't be crimes, but they've been made into crimes by the Coronavirus Act, which had almost no scrutiny by MPs, and the coronavirus regulations, which really are now becoming defunct and are not doing anything anymore to reduce the spread of the virus, and are actually having a very, very bad effect on people's relationships with each other in civil society. I really don't think that people in their gilded cages in the television studios and the Houses of Parliament realise what effect this is having on people and communities on a granular level. So we need to get back to a place where people do not get outraged over each other for going to the park, or lying in the park sunbathing, or going for a walk on the beach with their family, and stop considering that to be a criminal activity. Because if this goes on, I dread to think what's going to happen to society. And this has been unleashed by people who really haven't thought about the effects of this. Now, the purpose, as they said, of having all of these lockdown measures was to protect the NHS, to make sure that the demand for hospital beds did not exceed the capacity. So we've had this lockdown. They've built these huge new facilities, these Nightingale hospitals, which have got, the one in East London has got capacity for 4,000 patients, but it's only had 19 patients as the last time I heard. It's not needed. Well, that's a good thing. You hope for the best and prepare for the worst. They prepared for the worst didn't happen, and actually now there is more hospital capacity than we've had in many years, because people aren't going into hospital for other things like knee operations and hip operations and so on, because all the patients for other purposes have been moved out to prepare in case there was a massive surge of people for this Wuhan virus. But that hasn't happened, and so now the demand for hospital beds is going down. So now it's time to get out of this lockdown, shut down, start opening things up again. But what worries me even more than this extension for 3 weeks is the change in the narrative from some people in the government, who are starting to talk about not leaving a lockdown until there is a vaccine. And last week you had the health minister, Nadine Dorries, put out a tweet saying the only way out of a full lockdown is to have a vaccine. And Dominic Raab tweeted yesterday about the need for a vaccine to come out of lockdown. Well, to me, this is just ridiculous, because there's no guarantee that we're going to have a vaccine within a year or two, if ever. So what will happen if we don't find a vaccine for the next 5 years? Are we still going to stay in this kind of lockdown mentality, even if the number of cases goes down to near zero? I mean, that's absolutely ridiculous. So they've put out a list of 5 tests to get out of lockdown. This is the UK government. And it seems to me that they're so vague that they could keep us in it for forever if they wanted to, or they could be overturned whenever they decide to. I mean, one of the conditions is that the government has to be convinced or confident that there won't be a second peak. There won't be a case where the number of viruses goes up and it's starting to go down. There mustn't be any risk of it going up again. Well, how do they know that? You haven't got a time machine that can see the future. The only thing you can do to predict the future is mathematical modelling. But the mathematical modelling that got us into that, which was Professor Ferguson of Imperial College's modelling that said we're going to have 500,000 people dying from coronavirus, has been completely discredited. So we need to consider the real data, which is in now, which is showing that Sweden and Brazil, Japan, countries which have not had a lockdown, are not significantly worse off than countries that have had a lockdown. In some cases, much better. So my opinion is we need to start opening the country up tomorrow. We could get primary schools open tomorrow on Monday if we wanted. Well, it's maybe a little bit late now because teachers obviously need to prepare lessons and so on. But you can do that next week. Get garden centres open. Get cafes open. And start getting things back to normal before we have hundreds of thousands of businesses going bankrupt, and meaning that hundreds of thousands of people will lose their jobs and not have a job to go to, and before we tear this country apart because of conflict and acrimony between the police and the people, and between neighbours and neighbours.